Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into one of history's quietest mysteries. The strange and sleepy story of the ancient Maya and the long, slow silence that settled over their cities. So dim the lights a little, get comfortable. Maybe pull a blanket over your legs. Because for the next while we're wandering through humid jungles, abandoned temples, and a civilization that slowly packed up and disappeared, without leaving us a neat explanation. And honestly, historians love a neat explanation, but the Maya clearly didn't feel like providing one. Which, if we're being fair, is very on brand for ancient history. People build massive cities, invent advanced calendars, create beautiful art, and then quietly vanish, leaving archaeologists centuries later to stand in the ruins, scratching their heads and muttering things like, well, that's inconvenient. So tonight we're going to glide slowly through the story of the Maya world, the rise of their dazzling cities, the daily life of the people who lived there, and the strange, almost eerie quiet that followed when those cities began to empty out one by one. The Maya civilization spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. This region is full of thick forests, heavy rains, steamy heat, and an endless soundtrack of insects and birds. Not exactly the easiest place to build giant stone cities, but the Maya did it anyway, because ancient people had a remarkable habit of building impressive things in locations that would make modern construction companies immediately ask for hazard pay. By around 250 CE, the Maya world had entered what historians call the Classic period, which sounds very neat and tidy, like the civilization politely announced that it was entering its golden age. In reality, it was more like dozens of competing city-states rising and falling, each ruled by kings who loved fancy titles, elaborate ceremonies, and monuments that made them look extremely impressive. These kings had names that translated into things like Jaguar Paw, Stormy Sky, or Smoking Frog. And yes, Smoking Frog was apparently a real royal name. Historians are still not entirely sure what he did to earn that title, but it certainly sounds memorable. Maya cities were not quiet little villages tucked into the jungle. Some of them were huge. The city of Tikal, for example, had towering temples rising above the forest canopy, broad plazas filled with people, and a population that may have reached 60,000 or more. Imagine walking through that city on a warm morning. The air is humid, parrots are squawking somewhere in the trees, and the plazas are already busy with merchants, farmers, and nobles heading toward ceremonies. Stone pyramids climb high above everything else, their steep steps leading to temples where priests perform rituals and burn incense that drifts lazily across the city. It would have been colorful, noisy, and alive. Not the sort of place that looks like it's about to quietly vanish from history. And yet, over the centuries, something strange began to happen. Around the late 700s and early 800s, inscriptions on monuments started to slow down. Kings who once proudly carved their achievements into stone suddenly stopped doing so. Construction projects halted. New temples were not completed. And slowly, very slowly, people began leaving the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands. Not all at once, not in some dramatic apocalypse, just leaving. A few families at first, then more, until plazas that once held festivals and ceremonies became quiet open spaces with weeds creeping through the stones. Of course, historians have spent decades trying to explain why this happened. And the honest answer is that there probably wasn't just one reason. Ancient civilizations rarely collapse because of a single dramatic event, despite how much movies enjoy explosions and fiery endings. The Maya collapse was more like a slow unraveling. Climate changes may have brought long periods of drought. Population growth had pushed farming systems to their limits. Rival city-states fought wars that drained resources and destabilized alliances. Kings who once claimed a divine authority suddenly looked a lot less impressive when crops failed and water reservoirs ran dry. And when people lose faith in the rulers who claim to speak for the gods, well, things tend to unravel. But before the silence, the Maya world was incredibly sophisticated. Their calendar system was astonishingly precise. They tracked time using multiple overlapping calendars, including the famous long count calendar that recorded dates across vast stretches of time. While people on the internet occasionally panic about Maya calendar endings, the Maya themselves were not predicting the end of the world. They were simply counting time the way we count years. When one cycle ended, another began. Very calm, very orderly. No dramatic doomsday announcements required. Maya scribes also developed one of the most complex writing systems in the ancient Americas. Their glyphs recorded royal genealogies, political events, and religious rituals. For a long time, scholars could not read these inscriptions, which made the ruins feel even more mysterious. Imagine standing in a jungle temple surrounded by carved symbols that nobody could understand. It would feel a bit like discovering a library where every book is locked in a language you cannot read. Fortunately, modern epigraphers slowly deciphered the glyphs during the 20th century, revealing stories of alliances, rivalries, royal births, and the occasional unfortunate defeat in battle. And the royal families themselves were, well, complicated. Maya kings presented themselves as divine intermediaries between the human world and the gods. They performed elaborate rituals that included bloodletting ceremonies, where rulers pierced their skin with sharp objects to offer their blood to the gods. From a modern perspective, that sounds rather intense, but for the Maya it was part of maintaining cosmic balance. Kings were expected to perform these rituals to ensure the stability of the universe, which is a lot of pressure for one person, especially when your job description includes both ruling a city and occasionally stabbing yourself with ceremonial tools. Royal courts were also places of politics, alliances, and the occasional dramatic rivalry. Marriages linked powerful families across cities. Diplomats traveled between courts carrying gifts and messages. And of course, wars broke out from time to time, because neighboring kingdoms with ambitious rulers tend to disagree about borders and power. Captured nobles were sometimes paraded in ceremonies to demonstrate victory. It was a world where prestige mattered enormously, and rulers invested huge amounts of effort into monuments that proclaimed their greatness. But monuments require resources. They require labor, stone, food for the workers, and the stable authority of rulers who can organize those efforts. When droughts struck and harvests became unreliable, maintaining those massive building projects grew harder. Reservoirs that once stored rainwater began to run low. Farmers struggled to produce enough maize to support growing populations. And slowly the political structure that held these cities together started to wobble. Archaeological evidence shows that some Maya regions experienced severe droughts during the 9th century. Lake sediments reveal periods when rainfall dropped significantly. Imagine living in a tropical city built in a region that depends heavily on seasonal rains, and suddenly those rains begin to fail. Crops shrink, water supplies become uncertain, people grow anxious, priests perform rituals asking the gods for relief. Kings organize ceremonies meant to restore cosmic order, but the sky remains stubbornly dry. When environmental stress meets political competition, the results are rarely calm. Rival city-states may have fought more frequently as resources became scarce. Alliances broke down, trade networks weakened, and the authority of kings who claimed divine favor began to look a little shaky. If the ruler insists that he maintains harmony between the gods and the world, but the crops are failing anyway, people eventually start asking quiet questions. So families began moving away from the great ceremonial centers. Some migrated toward regions with more reliable water. Others may have returned to smaller farming communities. The Maya civilization itself did not vanish. This is important. Millions of Maya people continued living throughout the region. Their descendants are still there today. What collapsed were the large classic period city systems of the southern lowlands, not the entire culture. But the visual effect is still haunting. When archaeologists explore these ancient cities today, they walk through towering temples surrounded by forest. Roots twist through stone steps. Vines climb across carved monuments. Birds nest in the corners of abandoned plazas. And the quiet feels almost surreal when you remember that these places once held tens of thousands of people. One by one, the inscriptions stopped. The last known monument at the city of Copan was carved in the year 822. After that, silence, not a dramatic explosion of history, just the slow fading of written records. It is as if the scribes simply set down their tools and walked away. Let's drift for a moment through what one of those final days might have looked like. The morning air is warm and damp. A few market stalls open in the plaza, though there are fewer merchants than there used to be. A temple staircase that once bustled with priests preparing ceremonies is mostly empty. Families quietly pack bundles of belongings. Someone loads baskets with maize and tools. A child asks where they are going. The answer is probably vague. Somewhere with water. Somewhere with better harvests. Somewhere the future feels a little less uncertain. And slowly, over years and decades, the forest begins reclaiming the city. Of course, the Maya world did not completely fade into obscurity forever. Centuries later, new cities rose in the northern Yucatan, places like Chichen Itza, where different political systems and architectural styles flourished. Trade networks shifted toward coastal routes. Cultural traditions continued evolving. But the old southern cities remained quiet, their temples standing like stone memories beneath the jungle canopy. European explorers would not encounter many of these ruins until the 19th century. When travelers like John Lloyd Stephens and artist Frederick Catherwood visited the region in the 1800s, they described astonishing stone structures hidden deep in the forest. Catherwood's detailed drawings revealed towering pyramids, intricate carvings, and massive plazas swallowed by vegetation. For readers back in Europe and the United States, it sounded almost unbelievable. Entire cities lost in the jungle. Modern archaeology has since uncovered hundreds of Maya sites using ground surveys, satellite imagery, and airborne LiDAR technology that can detect structures beneath dense forest. Each discovery adds pieces to the puzzle of how these cities functioned and why they were abandoned. And yet the overall feeling remains the same. The collapse was not a single moment. It was a long, quiet process. Which brings us back to that strange silence historians often mention. Civilizations usually leave dramatic endings in our imagination. Empires fall with battles, invasions, and fiery destruction. The Maya collapse, by contrast, feels more like a fading echo. Cities gradually empty. Monuments stop appearing. Forests slowly grow over plazas where ceremonies once echoed with music and voices. And there is something oddly peaceful about that image, even if the reality for the people living through it was probably full of uncertainty and hardship. History does not always end with a bang. Sometimes it just drifts away. So as we continue tonight, we'll wander deeper into the daily life of the Maya world before that silence arrived. We'll look at the farmers who worked the fields, the scribes who painted glyphs onto bark paper books, and the kings who tried very hard to convince everyone that the universe depended on their leadership. Because naturally, ancient kings everywhere tended to believe the cosmos revolved around them. And next we'll gently float over to the rhythms of ordinary life in a Maya city, where the markets were busy, the temples were tall, and absolutely nobody suspected that centuries later historians would still be calmly puzzling over why it all grew so quiet. And next we gently float into the everyday rhythm of a Maya city before the quiet years began. Because while the collapse is mysterious and dramatic in hindsight, the people living there were mostly busy doing extremely ordinary things like farming, trading, arguing with neighbors, and trying to avoid the tropical heat that arrived every afternoon like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. Life in a Maya city did not feel like living inside a history documentary. It felt like daily routine, familiar streets, and the steady rhythm of work that kept the entire civilization running. Most Maya people were farmers, which is not very surprising because most humans throughout history have been farmers. The Maya depended heavily on maize, which we call corn today, along with beans and squash. These three crops were often grown together in a system that modern agricultural scientists still admire because the plants support each other in surprisingly clever ways. Corn stalks provide a structure for bean vines to climb. Beans add nitrogen to the soil, and squash spreads across the ground, shading the dirt and helping keep moisture inside. It is a quiet little partnership between plants, and the Maya understood it very well. A typical farmer would wake early in the morning, long before the tropical sun turned the air into warm soup. The sky at dawn in the Maya lowlands often glowed pale pink over the jungle canopy while birds began their enthusiastic morning concerts. Farmers walked out to their fields carrying simple tools, sometimes made from stone blades attached to wooden handles. The work was steady and repetitive, clearing weeds, checking crops, repairing terraces, hoping for rain but not too much rain, because agriculture has always been a delicate balance between optimism and mild anxiety. Maize was not just food. It was central to Maya identity. According to Maya mythology, humans themselves were created from maize dough by the gods, which is honestly a fairly comforting origin story. Some cultures say humans were shaped from clay or dust, but the Maya looked at their staple food and said, yes, that seems about right. We are basically made of corn. After the morning work in the fields, people would return toward the city carrying baskets of produce or bundles of firewood. The closer they came to the city center, the busier the streets became. Vendors set up small stalls selling food, pottery, textiles, and tools. The smell of cooking drifted through the air, especially tortillas made from freshly ground maize. Grinding maize into flour was a daily task usually handled by women using stone grinding tools called metates. It was hard work, repetitive, and time-consuming, but it produced the soft dough that became the base of most meals. Markets in Maya cities were lively places. Traders from nearby villages arrived carrying cacao beans, colorful feathers, obsidian blades, honey, salt, and sometimes exotic items from distant regions. Cacao in particular was extremely valuable. It could be consumed as a bitter chocolate drink during ceremonies, but cacao beans also worked as a form of currency. So if someone walked into the market carrying a small bag of cacao beans, they were essentially carrying their wallet. The nobles of the city moved through these same plazas, though they usually dressed in more elaborate clothing. Feathered headdresses, jade jewelry, and embroidered textiles signaled high status. Maya society was very aware of hierarchy. Everyone understood who belonged to the royal court, who served as priests, who were skilled artisans, and who spent most of their time in the fields. Social mobility was not exactly a popular concept in ancient kingdoms. If you were born into a farming family, chances were high that farming would remain your main career choice. At the center of the city stood the ceremonial architecture that made Maya urban landscapes so visually dramatic. Steep pyramids rose above plazas like stone mountains. Some temples reached heights that dominated the skyline, their staircases climbing sharply upward toward small shrine rooms at the top. Priests performed rituals there while smoke from burning incense drifted slowly across the city. These ceremonies often involved music, chanting, and offerings to the gods who governed rain, agriculture, the sun, and many other aspects of the universe. One of the most important gods was Chak, the rain god. And honestly, if you live in a farming society that depends on seasonal rainfall, having a dedicated rain god makes perfect sense. Priests performed rituals asking Chak to deliver rain at the right moment. Not too early, not too late, and ideally not during your outdoor ceremony. Managing the weather was apparently part of the job description for divine beings. Royal courts organized many of these ceremonies. The king, known as the Ajah, presented himself as the sacred bridge between human society and the supernatural world. When the king appeared in public rituals, he wore magnificent clothing decorated with jade, shells, and bright feathers. From a distance he must have looked almost otherworldly, which was exactly the point. Kings wanted their subjects to see them as powerful figures chosen by divine forces. But royal life was not all graceful ceremony. Palace courts were also full of political maneuvering, rival families, and the occasional dramatic disagreement about succession. Kings needed heirs, preferably healthy ones, and royal marriages were often arranged to strengthen alliances with neighboring cities. These alliances could be very useful when trade routes needed protection, or when a rival kingdom started behaving aggressively. Inside palace compounds, scribes and artists worked quietly recording royal history. Maya scribes were highly trained individuals who knew how to write complex glyphs and paint detailed illustrations. They created books from bark paper coated with lime plaster, forming pages that could be folded like an accordion. These books contained astronomical observations, rituals, genealogies, and stories from mythology. Sadly, very few of these books survived into modern times because the humid climate destroyed many of them, and later, Spanish colonizers burned others. Only a handful remain today, which means an enormous library of Maya knowledge quietly disappeared. It is one of those moments in history where scholars collectively sigh and wish someone had invented waterproof storage earlier. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued outside the palace walls. Children played games in the plazas or helped their families with daily chores. Potters shaped clay vessels used for cooking and storage. Weavers created textiles using cotton or plant fibers. Hunters traveled into the forest searching for deer, turkeys, and smaller animals. Fishermen worked along rivers and lakes. The Maya also loved a very energetic ball game played in large stone courts found in many cities. The exact rules varied across regions and centuries, but the game involved a heavy rubber ball that players struck with their hips, shoulders, or forearms. The goal was to keep the ball in play and sometimes send it through stone rings mounted high on the court walls. Imagine playing a sport where you cannot use your hands and the ball is dense rubber flying toward you at uncomfortable speeds. It probably required impressive athletic skill and perhaps a small amount of bravery. Ball games had ceremonial significance as well. In mythology, the hero twins played a cosmic ball game against gods of the underworld. So matches could symbolize struggles between cosmic forces, which means a sporting event in a Maya city might carry deeper meaning than simply scoring points. It was entertainment, ritual, and mythology all blended together. Evenings in a Maya city slowly settled into a calmer rhythm. The intense tropical heat faded slightly after sunset. Families gathered to eat meals of tortillas, beans, squash, and sometimes meat or fish. Storytelling was common. Elders passed down myths about gods, heroes, and the creation of the world. Above them, the night sky stretched wide and brilliant. With little artificial light, the stars must have appeared incredibly bright. Maya astronomers carefully observed those stars. They tracked the movements of Venus, the moon, and other celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. Their observations influenced calendars, rituals, and agricultural planning. Watching the sky was not just curiosity. It was a way of understanding time itself. And for many generations, this system worked. Cities flourished, kings ruled, farmers harvested maize. Markets buzzed with trade. Life felt stable enough that people built enormous temples meant to last forever. Ancient civilizations often believed their world would continue indefinitely. After all, when you grow up surrounded by massive stone structures built by your ancestors, permanence seems like a reasonable assumption. But slowly, almost invisibly at first, the balance began to shift. Drought cycles may have grown longer. Forest clearing for agriculture may have strained local ecosystems. Population pressure increased as cities expanded. What once felt stable began developing small cracks. A reservoir might run lower than usual one dry season. A harvest might produce slightly less maize. A rival city might launch a raid that interrupts trade routes. None of these events alone would end a civilization. But together, they create a subtle atmosphere of uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads quietly through a society. Farmers notice it first. They watch their crops carefully and compare this year's yield to previous seasons. Merchants notice when certain goods arrive less frequently in the markets. Priests perform extra ceremonies when the rains arrive late. Kings organized new monuments, celebrating victories or divine favor, perhaps hoping to reassure everyone that the gods still support their rule. But reassurance only works for so long. So while daily life continued much as it always had, something beneath the surface was slowly shifting. The great Maya city still stood tall and proud above the jungle canopy. Their plazas still hosted ceremonies and markets. Children still played in the streets. Priests still burned incense for the gods. Yet somewhere in the background, quietly and patiently, the long silence of the Maya collapse was beginning to approach. And in the next stretch of our slow wandering through history, we'll drift into the world of Maya kings themselves, those elaborately dressed rulers who believed they held the cosmos together through ritual politics and a generous amount of royal confidence. Because when things started going wrong in the Maya world, those kings were the first people everyone looked toward for answers. And as it turns out, ruling a complex jungle civilization during droughts and political rivalries was not always the relaxing royal experience the monuments like to suggest. And now we slowly drift toward the people who believed they were holding the entire universe together, the Maya kings, those elaborately dressed rulers who stood at the center of city life and calmly insisted that the stability of the cosmos depended at least a little bit on them personally. Which, if you think about it, is quite a bold claim. But ancient kings everywhere were fond of bold claims. It was almost part of the job description. If you are going to rule thousands of people and convince them that your family deserves that position forever, you might as well suggest that the gods themselves approve the arrangement. In the Maya world, the king was called the Ajah, a title that meant lord or ruler. The Ajah was not simply a political leader in the modern sense. He was a sacred figure who performed rituals meant to keep the balance between the human world and the supernatural one. Kings were expected to communicate with gods and ancestors, interpret signs from the heavens, and ensure that rain arrived at the proper time. So yes, being a Maya king involved a lot of responsibility. It also involved wearing extremely impressive clothing. Royal costumes were elaborate creations made from jade beads, jaguar skins, bright feathers from tropical birds, and finely woven textiles. Some headdresses rose so high above the king's head that they looked like small forests made of feathers. Jade jewelry gleamed in the sunlight during ceremonies, signaling wealth and sacred power. Jade was especially important because its green color reminded people of maize plants and life itself. Of course, all this splendor was carefully designed to send a message. When ordinary citizens gathered in a plaza and saw their ruler emerging from a palace doorway wearing shimmering ornaments and towering feathers, the effect must have been quite dramatic. The king did not look like an ordinary person. He looked like someone touched by divine forces. And that visual impression helped reinforce the idea that he really was chosen to guide the city. Royal courts were busy places filled with nobles, scribes, priests, advisors, and relatives. Politics inside these courts could become complicated very quickly. Dynasties stretched across generations, and everyone cared deeply about who would inherit the throne next. Kings wanted their sons to succeed them, but rival branches of the royal family sometimes had other ideas. If a ruler died without a clear heir, things could become awkward in the way ancient succession crises often do. Scribes recorded royal events on stone monuments called stelae. These tall carved slabs were placed in plazas where everyone could see them. The carvings showed kings standing proudly in ceremonial clothing, while glyphs around them described victories, alliances, and important rituals. Reading these monuments today is a bit like scrolling through a carefully curated social media profile. The king always looks confident, successful, and completely in control of events. Naturally, the monuments rarely mention awkward moments like failed harvests or political disagreements. Kings preferred to celebrate triumphs. A victory in battle would be carved into stone. A major ceremony marking the end of a calendar cycle would appear in elegant glyphs. A royal birth or marriage would be proudly recorded for future generations. One famous Maya ruler was a king of the city of Copan named 18 Rabbit, whose real name in Maya glyphs is usually translated as Waxiclajun of Goakiawil. Historians often shorten it to 18 Rabbit because it is easier to say and frankly sounds slightly more relaxed. King 18 Rabbit ruled during the early 8th century and oversaw an impressive period of construction in Copan. Temples were expanded, monuments were carved, and the city's plazas filled with beautiful sculptures. Looking at these monuments today, you might imagine that 18 Rabbit spent his reign calmly supervising artistic projects and enjoying the admiration of his people. Unfortunately, royal life rarely remains that peaceful for long. Rival cities existed throughout the Maya world, and occasionally those rivals became ambitious. In the year 738, something rather unfortunate happened to King 18 Rabbit. A neighboring city called Quirigua rebelled against Copan's authority and captured him during a conflict. Being captured as a king in ancient times was rarely a pleasant experience. The record suggests that 18 Rabbit was executed shortly afterward. It was a dramatic reminder that royal prestige could vanish very quickly when political alliances shifted. Copan survived the crisis, but the event must have shaken the confidence of the royal court. And that brings us to one of the delicate challenges faced by Maya rulers. Their authority depended heavily on the perception that they maintained cosmic harmony. When things went well, kings appeared powerful and divinely favored. But when disasters struck, people naturally wondered whether the ruler had somehow lost that favor. Imagine being a king during a period of drought. Farmers complain that the rains are late. Reservoirs begin to look worryingly shallow. Priests perform ceremonies asking the rain god Chak to intervene, but the sky remains stubbornly clear. The king organizes another ritual. Perhaps he offers valuable jade or performs bloodletting to demonstrate devotion. Everyone hopes the gods will respond. And if the rains finally arrive, the king looks very successful. But if they do not, well, confidence can begin to erode. Many Maya rituals involved bloodletting performed by royal figures. Kings or queens pierced their skin using sharp stingray spines or obsidian blades. The blood was collected on paper strips that were then burned as offerings to the gods. The rising smoke symbolized communication with the supernatural world. From a modern perspective, this practice might sound intense, but for the Maya, it was a sacred act demonstrating commitment to maintaining cosmic order. Royal women also played important ceremonial roles. Queens participated in rituals, oversaw palace life, and sometimes acted as regents for young heirs. Dynastic marriages connected powerful families across different cities, strengthening alliances and expanding influence. Inscriptions often highlight royal mothers and wives because their lineage could legitimize a ruler's claim to the throne. So the royal family was not just one individual wearing fancy feathers. It was a network of relatives, advisors, priests, and nobles all participating in the delicate machinery of governance. Maintaining stability required diplomacy, strategic marriages, trade relationships, and the occasional show of military strength. War between Maya cities did occur, though it often took the form of targeted conflicts rather than massive territorial conquests. Capturing important nobles or rulers could dramatically shift the balance of power. Victories were celebrated with ceremonies and monuments that reminded everyone exactly who had come out on top. But war also drained resources. Armies required food and supplies. Alliances had to be maintained. And if conflicts happened during periods of environmental stress, the pressure on a city could increase rapidly. A kingdom already struggling with drought might find it difficult to support military campaigns and large building projects at the same time. As the 8th century progressed, inscriptions in some regions began recording more frequent conflicts. Rivalries intensified. Some cities rose in power while others weakened. Trade networks shifted as political alliances changed. The Maya world was never a single unified empire. It was a mosaic of city-states, each navigating its own challenges. And through all of this, the kings continued presenting themselves as confident guardians of order. New monuments appeared celebrating calendar cycles or royal anniversaries. Ceremonies filled the plazas. Priests burned incense while musicians played drums and flutes. To someone visiting the city during one of these festivals, everything might have looked perfectly stable. Yet beneath that surface of ritual and tradition, pressures were quietly building. Population levels in some regions had grown very high, placing increasing demands on farmland and water supplies. Forests were cleared to create new agricultural fields, altering local environments. Drought periods may have grown more severe. Trade routes shifted as cities competed for influence. None of these changes announced themselves dramatically. History rarely provides warning labels. Instead, problems accumulate slowly, like small cracks forming in the foundation of a building. Each crack alone seems manageable, but over time they begin connecting to one another. By the early 9th century, inscriptions in several southern Maya cities began to stop. The monuments that once celebrated royal ceremonies became fewer and fewer. Construction projects slowed. Some temples were left unfinished, their stone blocks waiting patiently for workers who never returned. Kings who once appeared confident in their carved portraits must have faced uncomfortable realities. Fewer resources, fewer laborers. Growing uncertainty among the population. Perhaps some rulers attempted reforms or alliances to stabilize their cities. Unfortunately, the archaeological record rarely captures those quieter efforts. Eventually, many royal courts seem to have dissolved as people moved away from the great ceremonial centers. Without large populations to support them, the elaborate palaces and temples lost their purpose. The kings who believed they held the universe together faded from history along with their cities. And the silence that followed was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, like a long exhale after centuries of noise and activity. In the next part of our slow journey through the Maya collapse, we will drift closer to the environmental side of the story. Those changing climate patterns and drought cycles that may have nudged an already complicated civilization toward its quiet transformation. Because sometimes the biggest forces shaping history are not ambitious kings or dramatic battles, but the patient rhythms of rainfall, soil, and forests that decide whether crops grow or wither under the sun. And now, as we slowly approach the end of tonight's wandering story, we drift into one of the quiet forces that may have gently nudged the Maya world toward its long silence: the climate itself, that steady background rhythm of rain, soil, and sunlight that farmers depend on but can never completely control. Ancient civilizations often rise in places where nature cooperates, just enough to allow large populations to grow. But when that cooperation begins to wobble even slightly, the results can ripple through society in surprisingly powerful ways. The Maya lowlands depend heavily on seasonal rainfall. Unlike river civilizations that sit beside giant water sources, many Maya cities were built in regions without large permanent rivers. Instead, they relied on rainwater stored in reservoirs, ponds, and natural sinkholes called cenotes. During the rainy season, these reservoirs filled up, providing water for drinking, cooking, and agriculture. During the dry months, people depended on those stored supplies. For centuries, this system worked surprisingly well. Engineers in Maya cities built clever water storage systems with stone linings and channels that directed rainwater into reservoirs. Some cities even designed plazas and courtyards to help funnel rainfall toward storage areas. It was practical and impressive urban planning, especially in a tropical landscape where managing water could mean the difference between prosperity and hardship. But the system had one obvious weakness. If rainfall declined for long enough, those reservoirs would gradually shrink. Crops would struggle. Drinking water would become scarce. And life in a densely populated city would become increasingly uncomfortable. Modern scientists have studied lake sediments and cave formations across the Maya region, and these natural records suggest that several severe droughts occurred between roughly 800 and 1000 CE. These droughts were not constant desert conditions, but they may have involved repeated years of reduced rainfall. And repeated poor rainy seasons can slowly wear down even the most resilient agricultural system. Imagine a Maya farmer watching the sky during planting season. The clouds appear later than usual. Rain arrives, but perhaps not as heavily as before. The maize plants grow, but the harvest seems a little smaller. It is not a disaster yet, just a worrying pattern. The next year brings similar conditions. People start noticing. Farmers discuss it quietly while working in the fields. Merchants hear similar stories from nearby villages. Priests perform ceremonies asking the rain god for help. The king organizes rituals in the temple, offering incense, music, and sacred bloodletting in hopes of restoring cosmic balance. Sometimes the rains probably did return after these ceremonies, which must have reassured everyone that the gods were listening. But when drought cycles repeated several times across decades, confidence could begin to fade. The Maya world was not collapsing overnight. It was experiencing a long period of environmental stress that gradually made life in large urban centers harder to sustain. At the same time, population levels in many cities had reached impressive numbers. Tens of thousands of people living around ceremonial centers meant farmland had to expand further into surrounding forests. Trees were cleared to make room for crops. Soil was worked year after year to support growing communities. Deforestation can subtly change local climates by reducing shade, altering water retention in the soil, and increasing erosion during heavy rains. Over time, these environmental pressures might have combined with natural drought cycles to create even more challenging conditions. So the Maya world may have found itself in a delicate situation. Cities were large and complex. Royal courts required resources to maintain ceremonies and construction projects. Farmers needed reliable rainfall to feed growing populations. And trade networks had to function smoothly to move goods between regions. When multiple stresses appear at once, societies often begin adjusting in quiet ways. People move to places with better water sources. Communities shift towards smaller settlements where resources are easier to manage. Political alliances change as cities compete for limited supplies. And that seems to be exactly what happened in many parts of the southern Maya lowlands. Instead of dramatic destruction, we see gradual depopulation. Households moved away from major city centers. Monument carving slowed down. Construction projects stopped. The forest began creeping back toward plazas where festivals once filled the air with music and conversation. What makes the Maya collapse feel so surreal is that the civilization itself did not disappear. Maya culture continued across the region. New political centers rose in the northern Yucatan. Trade routes shifted toward coastal areas. Communities adapted to changing conditions. But the great classic period cities of the southern lowlands quietly faded into the jungle. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and many others gradually emptied. Temples that once hosted elaborate ceremonies became silent stone structures surrounded by growing trees. From an archaeological perspective, it is like watching a slow sunset. At first, everything still glows brightly. Then the light softens. Activity decreases. Eventually, the landscape grows calm and quiet. Centuries later, when explorers and scholars first encountered these ruins hidden beneath dense forest, the effect must have felt almost dreamlike. Massive pyramids rising above tangled vines. Stone staircases leading to temples that had not heard footsteps in generations. Carved monuments standing patiently in plazas where thousands of people once gathered, and the silence. The Maya collapse reminds us that civilizations are not permanent structures. They are living systems shaped by environment, politics, culture, and human decisions. When those factors shift, societies adapt in ways that may look mysterious from the outside, but probably felt practical to the people living through them. A family leaving a crowded city for farmland near a better water source was not thinking about historical collapse. They were thinking about feeding their children. A farmer choosing to settle closer to reliable rainfall was simply making a reasonable decision. Over time, thousands of those small decisions slowly changed the landscape of the Maya world. The temples remain because stone lasts longer than cities full of people. The inscriptions remain because scribes carved them deeply into monuments meant to honor kings forever. But the daily life that once filled those plazas drifted away into forests, villages, and new settlements across the region. And so the great cities grew quiet. Tonight we followed that quiet transformation from the bustling markets and ceremonies of Maya city life to the hesitant rains and shifting populations that slowly reshaped the landscape. It was not a dramatic ending filled with explosions or invading armies. It was something softer and more gradual. A civilization adjusting, moving, and transforming until the jungle once again surrounded the temples. And if you imagine standing in one of those ancient plazas today, perhaps at dusk when the forest grows calm and the air is warm and still, it is easy to picture what once existed there. The voices of merchants in the market, the sound of drums during ceremonies, children running across the stone pavement while priests burned incense high on the temple steps. Then the sounds fade, leaves rustle in the trees, birds call from the canopy, and the city rests quietly beneath the jungle sky, holding its stories in stone while history slowly drifts by. And once Victorian society had successfully transformed mourning into a detailed social ritual with specific fabrics, colors, and timelines, it did what human societies almost always do when rules become complicated, which is quietly build an entire commercial industry around helping people follow those rules correctly. Because as soon as grief acquired a dress code, someone inevitably realized that sadness could also become very profitable. And by the middle of the 19th century, London shops were happily selling every possible accessory required for a properly respectable mourning period. Entire storefronts were devoted to mourning attire, and these shops were not shy about advertising their services to recently bereaved families who might feel overwhelmed by etiquette manuals and social expectations. So they promised to provide everything needed to present grief in the most dignified and socially approved manner possible. One of the most famous establishments was Jay's Mourning Warehouse, which proudly described itself as a place where customers could obtain full mourning wardrobes with remarkable speed. Because apparently nothing says emotional devastation like efficiently purchasing 14 yards of black bombazine before lunch. The warehouse stocked dresses, gloves, hats, shawls, parasols, veils, ribbons, and even black-edged stationery, allowing grieving families to acquire a complete aesthetic of sorrow within a single shopping trip, which must have been both convenient and slightly surreal. Victorian advertisements often promised that mourning outfits could be delivered within 24 hours of a death, a marketing strategy that feels strangely practical, but also a little unsettling when you imagine how quickly these garments moved from shelf to funeral procession. And because social expectations were extremely strict, many families felt pressure to purchase the correct clothing immediately, since appearing in public without proper mourning attire could be interpreted as disrespectful or emotionally cold. This meant grief sometimes came with a price tag, and not a small one either, because full mourning wardrobes could be surprisingly expensive, especially when multiple family members were expected to dress according to the etiquette rules. A widow, for example, might require several dresses, different veils for various occasions, black gloves, and numerous accessories, all designed to communicate her loss clearly to society, while also maintaining the polished appearance expected from respectable Victorian citizens. And since the mourning period lasted months or even years, these garments were not simply worn once and forgotten, but became a long-term part of daily life, quietly accompanying the widow through every walk, visit, and letter-writing afternoon. Of course, wealthier families could afford luxurious fabrics and intricate details, while those with fewer resources sometimes struggled to meet the expectations of mourning etiquette without placing financial strain on their households. Some people reused older garments and dyed them black, while others borrowed clothing from relatives, which created a quieter, less glamorous side of Victorian mourning that rarely appeared in etiquette books, but certainly existed in everyday life. Still, the official ideal remained very polished and highly visible. And etiquette guides described mourning attire with the calm precision of instruction manuals, carefully listing which fabrics were acceptable and which decorative elements might be considered inappropriate. Bright silk, for example, was forbidden during deep mourning because it reflected light too cheerfully, which apparently risked suggesting that the wearer might be enjoying life more than etiquette considered acceptable during the early stages of grief. Jewelry was also limited at first, with many widows wearing only simple pieces made from dark materials like jet, a black gemstone formed from fossilized wood that became one of the most fashionable mourning materials of the century. Jet jewelry became so popular that entire communities specialized in carving it, most famously the coastal town of Whitby in England, where craftsmen transformed the glossy black stone into brooches, necklaces, bracelets, and earrings that looked appropriately solemn while still managing to be quite elegant. And since Victorian society appreciated symbolism, many of these pieces were shaped like urns, crosses, or delicate wreaths, subtle reminders of remembrance that could be worn quietly throughout daily life. Some brooches even opened like tiny lockets, revealing miniature portraits or carefully arranged strands of hair from the deceased, which again demonstrates the Victorian talent for combining sentimentality with a slightly eerie level of dedication to personal keepsakes. Hair jewelry deserves a brief moment of appreciation here, because the Victorians were astonishingly creative with it, weaving hair into complex patterns that resembled lace, flowers, or braided ropes, all preserved under glass or shaped into intricate ornaments. Families sometimes made these items at home as a way of expressing love and remembrance, turning the act of crafting jewelry into a gentle memorial ritual that helped process grief through careful, patient work. Of course, professional jewelers also offered their services, producing elaborate hairpieces that could become treasured heirlooms passed down through generations, quietly carrying the memory of someone long gone. Victorian mourning culture also extended beyond clothing and jewelry into the design of homes, because many households created small memorial spaces where portraits, photographs, and sentimental objects could be displayed respectfully. These spaces might include framed photographs of the deceased, favorite books, dried flowers from funerals, and other keepsakes arranged with quiet care, forming a kind of personal shrine that allowed family members to remember loved ones in a calm and reflective way. Photography itself became increasingly important during the 19th century, partly because the technology was improving, and partly because photographs offered something rare and precious, which was a permanent image of a person who might otherwise only exist in fading memory. In an age before smartphones or social media albums, a single photograph could carry enormous emotional value, and families sometimes kept these images in decorative albums or small lockets that stayed close to the heart. And while the Victorians certainly experienced genuine grief, their society also placed strong emphasis on public displays of emotional sincerity, meaning mourning often became both a private feeling and a visible performance. Visitors were expected to express condolences through carefully written letters, quiet visits, and respectful behavior that acknowledged the bereaved person's loss without forcing them into uncomfortable conversations. Even conversation topics were gently adjusted during mourning periods, avoiding excessive cheerfulness while still maintaining polite social interaction, which created a delicate balance between sympathy and everyday life. Etiquette books offered guidance for all of these situations, explaining how long condolence visits should last, how letters should be phrased, and even what tone of voice might be appropriate when speaking with someone experiencing loss. And if all of this sounds incredibly structured, that is because Victorian society believed strongly in the power of rules to guide emotional situations that might otherwise feel overwhelming. The idea was that clear expectations could provide comfort, offering mourners a path through grief that was already mapped out by tradition and social understanding. Of course, following these expectations could also feel restrictive, especially for individuals whose personal emotions did not neatly match the official timeline of mourning stages. Some people likely felt ready to return to normal life earlier than etiquette allowed, while others may have wished to remain in mourning longer than society considered appropriate. But the Victorian system prioritized collective standards over personal variation, encouraging everyone to follow the same general pattern so that grief could be recognized and respected within a shared cultural language. And in that sense, mourning attire became a kind of quiet communication, a visual message that told neighbors, shopkeepers, and acquaintances exactly what stage of grief someone was experiencing. A black dress with a heavy veil meant deep mourning. A slightly lighter fabric with subtle decoration suggested second mourning. A lavender ribbon or gray accessory hinted that the long journey back toward ordinary life had finally begun. These small signals allowed society to respond with appropriate sympathy while gradually welcoming the mourner back into everyday social activities. Yet despite the careful etiquette and structured timelines, grief itself remained unpredictable because human emotions rarely behave as neatly as social rules would prefer. And while Victorian mourning customs created an elaborate framework for expressing loss, the real experiences of the people wearing those black veils were still deeply personal, filled with quiet memories, lingering sadness, and the slow, uneven process of healing. So as we continue drifting through the quiet rituals of 19th century life, we begin to see that Victorian mourning was not simply about fashion or etiquette, but about finding ways to live alongside grief in a world where loss was both familiar and unavoidable. And strangely enough, the Victorians managed to transform that difficult reality into a system of rituals, garments, jewelry, letters, and photographs that together formed one of the most intricate mourning cultures the world has ever seen. But the story of Victorian grief does not end with clothing and accessories, because the era also developed some surprisingly unusual traditions that took remembrance into areas that modern audiences might find both fascinating and slightly peculiar. So let's drift a little further into the quiet candlelit rooms of the 19th century, where memorial practices sometimes became far more elaborate than anyone outside the Victorian imagination might expect. Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift slowly into a world where grief had rules, sadness had fashion trends, and even crying had a schedule, which may sound a little strange. But the people of Victorian Britain were extremely serious about mourning. And by serious, I mean they treated it with the same level of commitment most of us reserve for taxes or tea. So if you want, you can dim the lights, maybe settle into a comfortable position, and let your mind wander back to the 19th century, where people somehow managed to turn sorrow into an entire lifestyle industry. The Victorian era loved etiquette in general, which is a polite way of saying they were absolutely obsessed with telling each other how to behave, how to dress, how to sit, how to write letters, how to greet a neighbor, and apparently also how to mourn, because simply feeling sad was not nearly organized enough for them. And so they developed a very detailed system explaining exactly how long a person should remain sad, what color clothes they must wear while being sad, and which social events they were allowed to attend while continuing to be sad in the proper socially approved manner. Now the person who unintentionally became the global brand ambassador for dramatic mourning was Queen Victoria, who was already known for having strong feelings about almost everything. And when her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she reacted in a way that was both deeply emotional and extremely influential, because instead of gradually returning to normal life, she decided to remain in mourning clothing for the rest of her life, which turned what might have been a private tragedy into a national fashion statement that lasted decades. And when the queen of the largest empire on earth spends 40 years wearing black dresses and looking quietly devastated, people tend to copy that behavior, partly out of respect and partly because nobody wants to be the person who appears less respectful than the monarch. So suddenly mourning clothing became not just common, but practically mandatory for anyone who wanted to be seen as respectable in Victorian society. Victorian mourning was not casual, not flexible, and definitely not brief, because the official mourning period for a widow could last more than 2 years, which is a long time to commit to an outfit theme. And during the first phase known as deep mourning, A widow was expected to wear entirely black clothing made from dull fabrics that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, which sounds poetic but mostly meant wearing something called bombazine that looked about as cheerful as a rain cloud. The outfit also included a heavy black veil called a weeping veil, which could be so thick that it partially blocked the wearer's vision, meaning Victorian widows sometimes spent months navigating the world through a dark curtain of fabric while trying not to bump into furniture or accidentally walk into a lamppost, which must have made daily life just slightly more complicated than necessary. And because Victorians believed grief should be visible from across the street, these outfits were carefully designed to signal sorrow at a glance, meaning if someone saw a woman dressed entirely in matte black with a long veil trailing behind her like a shadow, they immediately knew she was in the early stages of mourning and should therefore be treated with a special combination of sympathy and polite distance. But here is where things become a little fascinating, because mourning clothing had phases, almost like a seasonal wardrobe for sadness, and after about a year, the widow could gradually transition into what was called second mourning, which allowed slightly lighter fabrics and subtle decorations like jet beads or lace, which was essentially Victorian society saying congratulations, you are still sad, but now you may accessorize. Eventually there was a final stage called half mourning, and this stage introduced colors that were apparently considered emotionally appropriate for someone who was beginning to recover, including muted purples, soft grays, and occasionally lavender, which created the rather surreal image of entire wardrobes carefully calibrated to reflect the emotional progress of grief, as if sadness itself had a color palette. Now this entire system did not just apply to widows, because Victorian etiquette books contained detailed charts explaining exactly how long a person should mourn for different relatives, which is both extremely organized and slightly unsettling, since it meant there was effectively a timetable for sadness depending on how closely related you were to the deceased. For example, mourning a parent might last a full year, mourning a sibling might last 6 months, and mourning a cousin might last a few weeks, which unintentionally created the impression that Victorian society had quietly ranked family members according to the acceptable duration of grief, something that would probably lead to very awkward family conversations if anyone thought too hard about it. There were also strict rules about social behavior during mourning, and these rules were surprisingly restrictive, because people in deep mourning were expected to avoid parties, concerts, theaters, and most public celebrations, which meant grief did not just change your wardrobe, but also temporarily removed you from much of social life. Even writing letters had etiquette, because letters sent during mourning were often written on black-bordered stationery that visually announced the presence of grief before the reader even opened the envelope, which was basically the 19th century equivalent of setting your social media status to currently grieving. Victorians also developed an entire market for mourning accessories, because once society creates strict dress rules, someone inevitably turns it into a profitable business. And so jewelers began producing mourning jewelry made from jet, onyx, and other dark stones that looked appropriately solemn. Some pieces even contained small compartments holding locks of hair from the deceased, which was considered a sentimental keepsake, but may feel slightly unusual to modern audiences who are not accustomed to wearing tiny memorial hair collections around their necks. And yes, hair jewelry was incredibly popular during the 19th century. Partly because hair does not decay quickly, and partly because Victorians had a very strong appreciation for sentimental objects that kept loved ones symbolically close, even if the method of doing so might raise a few eyebrows today. If you wandered into a Victorian jewelry shop, you might find bracelets woven from strands of hair, brooches containing delicate hair designs arranged like miniature wreaths, and lockets preserving a single curl, all presented with the calm assurance that this was a completely normal and tasteful way to remember someone. The Victorians also enjoyed mourning photography, which is exactly what it sounds like. And before you imagine something overly dramatic, it was often quite gentle and solemn, because families would sometimes photograph a deceased relative as a final keepsake in an era when photography was still relatively rare and precious. These photographs were usually staged carefully, sometimes showing the person peacefully resting. And although the practice may feel unusual today, it reflected a culture that was far more comfortable acknowledging death as part of daily life. Death in the 19th century was simply more visible because medical science was still developing and life expectancy was shorter, meaning most families experienced loss relatively often, which may explain why Victorian society developed such elaborate systems to process and display grief. And while all of this might sound heavy, the Victorians themselves viewed it as an important form of respect, a structured way to honor loved ones, while also signaling emotional sincerity to the community around them. Of course, the system also had its slightly absurd moments, because when human emotions are regulated by etiquette manuals, things occasionally become a little theatrical, and there were definitely people who treated mourning fashion with the same enthusiasm others reserved for Paris runway trends. Department stores even had entire mourning sections where customers could purchase complete outfits designed for every stage of grief, which means Victorian shopping trips sometimes involved selecting fabrics appropriate for one's current emotional status, a situation that modern retail marketing has somehow not yet attempted to replicate. And while some people genuinely appreciated the guidance these rules provided, others quietly found them exhausting, because maintaining strict mourning etiquette for months or years required constant attention to clothing, behavior, and social appearances. But Victorian society valued visible propriety above almost everything else, and so the rituals continued, weaving themselves into everyday life until grief itself became something that could be recognized instantly by a color, a veil, or the quiet rustle of black fabric passing down a London street. And as we slowly drift further into the strange, structured world of 19th century mourning customs, we begin to notice that what started as a sincere expression of loss gradually expanded into an elaborate social language, one where sadness had symbols, rules, stages, and occasionally even fashion upgrades. So let's gently wander deeper into this world, where sorrow came with dress codes and etiquette books, because Victorian society had only just begun turning mourning into one of the most detailed emotional performances in history, and there are still plenty of curious traditions waiting quietly ahead. And as Victorian mourning rituals continued to expand through the 19th century, they slowly moved beyond clothing and jewelry into something even more immersive, which was the idea that grief could shape an entire lifestyle, quietly influencing how people decorated their homes, arranged their daily routines, and even how they remembered the passage of time. Because in Victorian society, remembrance was not meant to fade quickly, and instead it lingered gently through small habits and quiet symbols that stayed present long after the funeral had ended and the official condolences had been delivered. Homes often reflected this lingering presence of memory, with framed photographs placed carefully on mantels, small locks of hair preserved in glass lockets, and memorial cards tucked into albums where family members could look through them on quiet evenings. These memorial cards were sometimes decorated with delicate illustrations of flowers, angels, or peaceful landscapes, offering a calm visual reminder of the person who had passed away without forcing grief into dramatic displays. And if you stepped into a Victorian parlor during this era, you might notice subtle signs of mourning scattered throughout the room. Small objects arranged thoughtfully as if the house itself was quietly participating in the process of remembrance. Portraits might be draped with black ribbons, clocks could be stopped at the hour of death for a short time, and mirrors were occasionally covered during funerals in some households, a tradition that reflected older cultural beliefs about reflection and the spirit. Victorian funerals themselves were also highly ceremonial events, filled with layers of etiquette that guided how people should dress, behave, and even walk during the procession. Black horses often pulled the hearse slowly through the streets, their harnesses decorated with dark plumes that swayed gently as they moved, creating a solemn atmosphere that was meant to communicate respect rather than spectacle. Professional mourners were occasionally hired as well, particularly by wealthier families who wanted the procession to appear appropriately dignified and well attended, which meant strangers sometimes walked alongside the coffin, simply to ensure the ceremony looked sufficiently serious. And while that might sound slightly theatrical today, Victorian culture believed strongly that public displays of respect were important for honoring the dead and supporting the grieving family. Graveyards during the 19th century also became places where mourning customs developed their own quiet traditions, turning cemeteries into carefully designed landscapes where families could visit, reflect, and remember. Victorian cemeteries were often landscaped like gardens, filled with trees, winding paths, and elaborate monuments that looked more like peaceful parks than somber burial grounds. Families visited these spaces regularly, sometimes bringing flowers or small tokens that could be placed near the grave, creating gentle rituals that allowed people to maintain a sense of connection with those who had passed away. Headstones themselves carried symbolic imagery that Victorians immediately understood, even if modern visitors might overlook the meaning hidden in the carvings. An hourglass, for example, symbolized the passage of time, while a broken column represented a life cut short, and ivy often appeared as a symbol of memory and enduring attachment. These symbols formed a quiet visual language across cemetery landscapes, allowing grief and remembrance to be expressed without needing long explanations. And if we look back at the influence of Queen Victoria, we can see how her personal devotion to mourning shaped the broader culture for decades. Because she never fully returned to bright court life after the death of Prince Albert, instead surrounding herself with his memory through portraits, statues, and preserved belongings. She even kept many of Albert's rooms arranged exactly as they had been during his life, which meant servants continued to lay out his clothes and prepare his study as if he might walk in at any moment, a habit that reveals just how deeply Victorian mourning could intertwine with daily routine. For many people, this long period of remembrance was not seen as unusual at all, but rather as a sign of loyalty and devotion that demonstrated the strength of emotional bonds within families. At the same time, Victorian mourning customs slowly began to soften toward the end of the century as social attitudes gradually shifted and the strict timelines became less rigid. Younger generations sometimes preferred simpler memorial practices, and the expansion of modern medicine slowly changed society's relationship with death by reducing the frequency of loss within families. But the elaborate traditions of the Victorian era left a lasting impression on cultural history, shaping how mourning was expressed throughout much of the English-speaking world. Even today, some subtle echoes remain, such as the tradition of wearing black at funerals or sending sympathy cards to grieving families. Small customs that continue quietly long after the original etiquette books have faded into history. And when we look back at the peculiar etiquette of Victorian mourning, it becomes clear that beneath all the black fabric, veils, jewelry, and carefully timed stages of grief was a society trying to make sense of loss in the only way it knew how. By creating rituals, symbols, and shared expectations, the Victorians built a framework that helped people navigate sadness without feeling completely lost inside it. Yes, some of those customs now feel unusual or overly formal, and a few may even seem slightly eccentric through modern eyes, but they were also sincere attempts to honor memory and express love in a world where death was a much more common visitor than it is for many people today. So the next time we imagine the quiet streets of 19th century London, with a figure dressed in soft black fabric walking slowly beneath a cloudy sky, it helps to remember that the clothing was only part of the story. Behind that veil was a culture filled with rituals of remembrance, a society that believed grief deserved time, patience, and a certain level of solemn elegance. And in its own calm and structured way, Victorian mourning turned sadness into something visible, shared, and strangely poetic, leaving behind one of the most unusual chapters in the long history of how humans remember the people they have loved and lost. Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the quietest jobs ever invented by human civilization. A job so lonely that your closest co-workers were usually waves, fog, and a lantern that refused to go out at 3 in the morning. So if you want to dim the lights, settle somewhere comfortable, and maybe let the sound of imaginary ocean wind drift through your thoughts, because tonight we're slowly wandering into the strange and peaceful world of lighthouse keepers and lightship crews, the people whose entire professional life was basically standing between ships and disaster, while also having absolutely no one to talk to most of the time. Now, when most people imagine maritime history, they usually picture dramatic naval battles, heroic explorers, or gigantic sailing ships racing across oceans. But the quiet truth is that most of maritime safety was handled by individuals whose lives were almost comically uneventful. People who spent months or years in isolated towers or floating stations, doing the same routine every single day, patiently making sure a light stayed lit so that strangers they would never meet could safely avoid crashing into rocks. And the lighthouse itself is one of those inventions that seems incredibly simple, but required enormous dedication to maintain. Because before automation existed, the light at the top of the tower did not magically turn on every evening like a modern street lamp. Instead, it depended entirely on the discipline of a human being climbing hundreds of steps, polishing lenses, trimming wicks, and checking fuel levels while the ocean wind politely tried to throw the entire structure into the sea. One of the earliest famous lighthouse keepers worked at the legendary Eddystone Lighthouse, which stood on a lonely reef in the English Channel where waves behaved less like gentle water and more like enthusiastic demolition equipment, and anyone assigned to work there quickly discovered that the job description included not only maintaining a light, but also surviving storms that treated the lighthouse like a punching bag. Early lighthouse designs were often optimistic in their engineering, which meant several versions of Eddystone Lighthouse were dramatically destroyed by storms before engineers finally built one strong enough to remain standing. So the keepers who worked there were essentially living inside a scientific experiment that the ocean kept trying to cancel. The daily routine of a lighthouse keeper was not glamorous, and it followed a rhythm so steady that time itself began to feel slightly blurry. Because every afternoon the keeper would begin preparing the lantern room by cleaning the glass panels and carefully polishing the enormous Fresnel lens that magnified the light into a beam visible for miles. The Fresnel lens, which became standard in the 19th century, was a masterpiece of optical engineering invented by Augustin Jean Fresnel, and it allowed lighthouse lamps to shine dramatically farther than older designs, which was wonderful for sailors but also meant lighthouse keepers had to treat the lens like a sacred object because fingerprints or dust could reduce its brightness. So imagine climbing a spiral staircase carrying cleaning cloths and oil containers, while the entire tower hums with wind and distant waves, then spending the evening carefully tending a flame that had to remain perfectly steady through the night, because if the light went out at the wrong moment, a ship somewhere in the darkness might suddenly find itself exploring a coastline far more closely than intended. And once the sun disappeared below the horizon, the keeper's real shift began. Because the lantern required constant attention, and depending on the era, this meant adjusting oil lamps, rotating the lens mechanism, and periodically checking that the flame was still burning brightly. Many lighthouses used clockwork rotation systems powered by heavy weights that slowly descended through the tower, which meant the keeper had to wind the mechanism regularly throughout the night, a task that essentially turned lighthouse maintenance into something resembling a very large and very expensive grandfather clock. So while most people on shore were sleeping peacefully, lighthouse keepers were quietly walking in circles at the top of a tower surrounded by darkness and ocean wind, making sure a light continued to sweep across the sea in slow rhythmic flashes. And because isolation was unavoidable, lighthouse keepers developed unusual daily habits simply to keep themselves entertained during long quiet weeks. Some kept detailed journals describing weather patterns, passing ships, and the occasional seabird that decided the lighthouse balcony looked like an excellent place to rest. Others filled their time reading enormous stacks of books that had been delivered months earlier by supply boats, slowly working through everything from adventure novels to agricultural manuals, simply because there was nothing else available. A few even developed hobbies like carving wood, repairing tools, or sketching the coastline from the lantern room windows, which offered spectacular views even if the company was mostly seagulls. In certain remote stations, the keeper's only human contact arrived during supply visits that happened every few weeks, when a small boat would bring food, oil letters, and newspapers that were often already outdated by the time they arrived. These deliveries became small celebrations of civilization, moments when the keeper could briefly exchange conversation with another human being before watching the boat disappear again, beyond the horizon. Of course, some lighthouses had teams of 2 or 3 keepers who rotated duties, which helped reduce loneliness slightly, although living with the same co-workers inside a narrow tower for months could also create its own peculiar social dynamics. Imagine sharing a tiny stone building with 2 colleagues, while storms shake the walls and the nearest town sits 20 miles away across unpredictable water. And suddenly the concept of workplace tension takes on a very different meaning. Still, many lighthouse keepers described their work with quiet pride because the job carried an unusual sense of purpose. And every night that the light shone clearly across, the sea meant ships could navigate safely through dangerous coastal waters. That feeling of responsibility was especially important in busy shipping regions like the coast near Bell Rock Lighthouse, one of the most famous lighthouses ever constructed, built on a reef that had wrecked ships for centuries before engineers finally decided enough was enough. The lighthouse was designed by the brilliant Scottish engineer Robert Stephenson, who came from a family that would eventually build dozens of lighthouses across Scotland, quietly shaping maritime safety, while most sailors probably had no idea who had designed the towers, guiding them through the night. Bell Rock's construction itself was a remarkable challenge, because workers could only build during low tide, when the reef briefly emerged from the water, meaning the entire project required patience, careful timing, and a willingness to get soaked by the North Sea on a fairly regular basis. Once completed, the lighthouse became a dependable guardian for ships traveling through one of the most dangerous parts of the Scottish coastline, and the keepers stationed there continued the slow, patient routine of lighting lamps, polishing lenses, and watching the horizon for passing vessels. But even with several keepers sharing the workload, life inside a lighthouse remained deeply quiet, because the ocean has a way of swallowing sound until the only constant noises are wind, waves, and the distant cry of seabirds. And over time, many keepers developed a strange sense of companionship with the landscape around them, learning to recognize individual ships by their silhouettes, noticing subtle changes in weather long before storms arrived, and memorizing the rhythms of tides that shaped the coastline below their tower. Some describe the experience almost like living inside a moving painting, where the sky and sea changed colors every few hours, while the lighthouse remained the still center of everything. Of course, not every moment was peaceful, because storms could transform the quiet routine into a tense night of rattling windows, roaring waves, and constant checks to make sure the lantern continued shining through sheets of rain and spray. During severe weather, the tower might shake slightly as enormous waves struck the rocks below, reminding the keeper that their home was essentially a tall stone cylinder standing in the path of nature's enthusiasm. Yet even in those moments, the light had to remain steady, because stormy nights were exactly when sailors needed it most. And so the keeper continued their routine of trimming wicks and winding mechanisms while the ocean outside attempted to demonstrate its dramatic personality. And when dawn finally arrived, bringing pale sunlight across the water, the keeper would extinguish the lamp, record the night's weather in a logbook, and begin another quiet day of maintenance tasks before evening inevitably returned. It was a life of repetition, patience, and remarkable solitude, but it also created a small community of individuals who shared the unusual experience of living between land and sea, guardians of a light that most sailors saw only briefly before continuing their journey into the distance. But the lonely world of maritime safety did not end with towers built on rocky coastlines, because sometimes the sea itself refused to provide a convenient place for construction, which meant engineers had to invent something even stranger than a lighthouse. And that is where the story quietly drifts toward one of the most unusual maritime jobs ever created: the crews who lived aboard floating lighthouses known as lightships, where the ocean surrounded them on every side, and the nearest land often felt like another planet slowly fading beyond the horizon. Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the quietest jobs ever invented by human civilization. A job so lonely that your closest co-workers were usually waves, fog, and a lantern that refused to go out at 3 in the morning. So if you want to dim the lights, settle somewhere comfortable, and maybe let the sound of imaginary ocean wind drift through your thoughts. Because tonight we're slowly wandering into the strange and peaceful world of lighthouse keepers and lightship crews, the people whose entire professional life was basically standing between ships and disaster, while also having absolutely no one to talk to most of the time. Now, when most people imagine maritime history, they usually picture dramatic naval battles, heroic explorers, or gigantic sailing ships racing across oceans. But the quiet truth is that most of maritime safety was handled by individuals whose lives were almost comically uneventful. People who spent months or years in isolated towers or floating stations, doing the same routine every single day, patiently making sure a light stayed lit so that strangers they would never meet could safely avoid crashing into rocks. And the lighthouse itself is one of those inventions that seems incredibly simple, but required enormous dedication to maintain. Because before automation existed, the light at the top of the tower did not magically turn on every evening like a modern street lamp. Instead, it depended entirely on the discipline of a human being climbing hundreds of steps, polishing lenses, trimming wicks, and checking fuel levels while the ocean wind politely tried to throw the entire structure into the sea. One of the earliest famous lighthouse keepers worked at the legendary Etiquette Lighthouse, which stood on a lonely reef in the English Channel where waves behaved less like gentle water and more like enthusiastic demolition equipment, and anyone assigned to work there quickly discovered that the job description included not only maintaining a light, but also surviving storms that treated the lighthouse like a punching bag. Early lighthouse designs were often optimistic in their engineering, which meant several versions of Etiquette Lighthouse were dramatically destroyed by storms before engineers finally built one strong enough to remain standing. So the keepers who worked there were essentially living inside a scientific experiment that the ocean kept trying to cancel. The daily routine of a lighthouse keeper was not glamorous, and it followed a rhythm so steady that time itself began to feel slightly blurry. Because every afternoon the keeper would begin preparing the lantern room by cleaning the glass panels and carefully polishing the enormous Fresnel lens that magnified the light into a beam visible for miles. The Fresnel lens, which became standard in the 19th century, was a masterpiece of optical engineering invented by Augustin Jean Fresnel, and it allowed lighthouse lamps to shine dramatically farther than older designs, which was wonderful for sailors but also meant lighthouse keepers had to treat the lens like a sacred object because fingerprints or dust could reduce its brightness. So imagine climbing a spiral staircase carrying cleaning cloths and oil containers while the entire tower hums with wind and distant waves, then spending the evening carefully tending a flame that had to remain perfectly steady through the night, because if the light went out at the wrong moment, a ship somewhere in the darkness might suddenly find itself exploring a coastline far more closely than intended. And once the sun disappeared below the horizon, the keeper's real shift began. Because the lantern required constant attention, and depending on the era, this meant adjusting oil lamps, rotating the lens mechanism, and periodically checking that the flame was still burning brightly. Many lighthouses used clockwork rotation systems powered by heavy weights that slowly descended through the tower, which meant the keeper had to wind the mechanism regularly throughout the night, a task that essentially turned lighthouse maintenance into something resembling a very large and very expensive grandfather clock. So while most people on shore were sleeping peacefully, lighthouse keepers were quietly walking in circles at the top of a tower surrounded by darkness and ocean wind, making sure a light continued to sweep across the sea in slow rhythmic flashes. And because isolation was unavoidable, lighthouse keepers developed unusual daily habits simply to keep themselves entertained during long, quiet weeks. Some kept detailed journals describing weather patterns, passing ships, and the occasional seabird that decided the lighthouse balcony looked like an excellent place to rest. Others filled their time reading enormous stacks of books that had been delivered months earlier by supply boats, slowly working through everything from adventure novels to agricultural manuals, simply because there was nothing else available. A few even developed hobbies like carving wood, repairing tools, or sketching the coastline from the lantern room windows, which offered spectacular views even if the company was mostly seagulls. In certain remote stations, the keeper's only human contact arrived during supply visits that happened every few weeks, when a small boat would bring food, oil letters, and newspapers that were often already outdated by the time they arrived. These deliveries became small celebrations of civilization, moments when the keeper could briefly exchange conversation with another human being before watching the boat disappear again, beyond the horizon. Of course, some lighthouses had teams of 2 or 3 keepers who rotated duties, which helped reduce loneliness slightly, although living with the same co-workers inside a narrow tower for months could also create its own peculiar social dynamics. Imagine sharing a tiny stone building with 2 colleagues, while storms shake the walls and the nearest town sits 20 miles away across unpredictable water. And suddenly the concept of workplace tension takes on a very different meaning. Still, many lighthouse keepers described their work with quiet pride because the job carried an unusual sense of purpose. And every night that the light shone clearly across, the sea meant ships could navigate safely through dangerous coastal waters. That feeling of responsibility was especially important in busy shipping regions like the coast near Bell Rock Lighthouse, one of the most famous lighthouses ever constructed, built on a reef that had wrecked ships for centuries before engineers finally decided enough was enough. The lighthouse was designed by the brilliant Scottish engineer Robert Stephenson, who came from a family that would eventually build dozens of lighthouses across Scotland, quietly shaping maritime safety, while most sailors probably had no idea who had designed the towers, guiding them through the night. Bell Rock's construction itself was a remarkable challenge, because workers could only build during low tide, when the reef briefly emerged from the water, meaning the entire project required patience, careful timing, and a willingness to get soaked by the North Sea on a fairly regular basis. Once completed, the lighthouse became a dependable guardian for ships traveling through one of the most dangerous parts of the Scottish coastline, and the keepers stationed there continued the slow, patient routine of lighting lamps, polishing lenses, and watching the horizon for passing vessels. But even with several keepers sharing the workload, life inside a lighthouse remained deeply quiet, because the ocean has a way of swallowing sound until the only constant noises are wind, waves, and the distant cry of seabirds. And over time, many keepers developed a strange sense of companionship with the landscape around them, learning to recognize individual ships by their silhouettes, noticing subtle changes in weather long before storms arrived, and memorizing the rhythms of tides that shaped the coastline below their tower. Some describe the experience almost like living inside a moving painting, where the sky and sea changed colors every few hours, while the lighthouse remained the still center of everything. Of course, not every moment was peaceful, because storms could transform the quiet routine into a tense night of rattling windows, roaring waves, and constant checks to make sure the lantern continued shining through sheets of rain and spray. During severe weather, the tower might shake slightly as enormous waves struck the rocks below, reminding the keeper that their home was essentially a tall stone cylinder standing in the path of nature's enthusiasm. Yet even in those moments, the light had to remain steady, because stormy nights were exactly when sailors needed it most. And so the keeper continued their routine of trimming wicks and winding mechanisms while the ocean outside attempted to demonstrate its dramatic personality. And when dawn finally arrived, bringing pale sunlight across the water, the keeper would extinguish the lamp, record the night's weather in a logbook, and begin another quiet day of maintenance tasks before evening inevitably returned. It was a life of repetition, patience, and remarkable solitude, but it also created a small community of individuals who shared the unusual experience of living between land and sea, guardians of a light that most sailors saw only briefly before continuing their journey into the distance. But the lonely world of maritime safety did not end with towers built on rocky coastlines, because sometimes the sea itself refused to provide a convenient place for construction, which meant engineers had to invent something even stranger than a lighthouse. And that is where the story quietly drifts toward one of the most unusual maritime jobs ever created. The crews who lived aboard floating lighthouses known as lightships, where the ocean surrounded them on every side, and the nearest land often felt like another planet slowly fading beyond the horizon. And as the 20th century slowly rolled forward with its usual collection of inventions, engineers began looking at lighthouses and lightships with the slightly suspicious expression people get when they realize a machine might be able to do a job that once required a very patient human being. Because technology had been improving steadily, and once electricity, automatic timers, and remote monitoring systems arrived, someone inevitably asked the obvious question, which was whether a lighthouse really needed a full-time resident human climbing the stairs every evening to light a lamp. The answer, from a purely technical perspective, turned out to be no. Although the transition from human keepers to automated systems happened slowly enough that many traditional lighthouse keepers spent decades watching the gradual transformation of their profession. At first the changes seemed small and harmless, like replacing oil lamps with electric bulbs that were brighter, easier to maintain, and much less likely to flicker during windy nights. Electric lighting also meant the elaborate routine of trimming wicks and refilling oil containers slowly disappeared, which was probably convenient but also removed one of the defining nightly rituals that had structured a keeper's life for generations. Next came automatic rotation systems powered by electric motors rather than clockwork weights, meaning the keeper no longer needed to wind heavy mechanisms throughout the night, like a very determined caretaker of a gigantic mechanical watch. Gradually, the lantern rooms became quieter places where machines handled tasks that once required constant attention, leaving lighthouse keepers with fewer reasons to climb the tower stairs at 3 in the morning. Eventually, remote monitoring technology allowed maritime authorities to supervise lighthouse operations from distant offices, checking the status of lights through electronic systems rather than relying on handwritten logbooks delivered by supply boats. And once that happened, the logic of automation became difficult to ignore, because maintaining isolated housing for lighthouse keepers was expensive, while automated beacons could function perfectly well without anyone living nearby. So across many coastlines, the same quiet story unfolded again and again as lighthouse stations that had once supported small communities of keepers slowly transitioned into unattended structures that simply blinked patiently into the darkness. The towers themselves often remained standing, still guiding ships exactly as they had before, but the rooms that once held beds, kitchens, and stacks of weather journals gradually became empty. For many longtime keepers, this change felt strangely emotional, because the job had always been more than just maintaining equipment. It had been a lifestyle built around solitude, routine, and the slow rhythm of tides and weather. Imagine spending 20 years climbing the same spiral staircase every evening, only to watch the system eventually replace your careful work with a quiet electric timer. Some keepers retired peacefully when automation arrived, while others transferred to different maritime roles, although many admitted that life away from the lighthouse felt slightly unfamiliar after so many years surrounded by sea and wind. The same transformation happened with lightships as well, although their fate was often even more dramatic, because new technologies created smaller floating buoys, equipped with flashing lights and radio transmitters that required almost no maintenance. These automated buoys could mark dangerous shoals just as effectively as a large ship filled with crew members, and unlike lightships, they did not require food deliveries, sleeping quarters, or sailors willing to spend months anchored in one location. So gradually the great floating lantern ships that had once guarded coastlines were retired, sold, or converted into museum exhibits where visitors could wander their decks and imagine what life had once been like for the crews who lived there. A few historic examples remain preserved today, including the well-known lightship Chesapeake, which now sits quietly as a museum vessel reminding visitors of the era when maritime safety depended on human crews floating patiently in the middle of busy sea routes. Walking aboard a preserved lightship today feels almost peaceful, because the cabins are small and simple. The lantern tower rises above the deck like a patient guardian, and the ocean horizon still stretches endlessly beyond the railings, just as it did decades ago. It becomes easy to imagine the sailors who once stood watch there at night, listening to foghorns echo through the mist while distant ships drifted past like silent shadows. Lighthouses themselves have fared slightly better because many of them remain active navigation aids, even in the age of satellites and digital maps. Ships today rely heavily on GPS technology to determine their position, but physical lights along coastlines still provide a reassuring visual reference when sailors approach land during dark or foggy conditions. So although the human keepers may be gone, the lights themselves continue shining faithfully across the water, just as they did centuries ago. Many historic towers have also become popular heritage sites where visitors climb the spiral staircases once used by keepers and look out from lantern balconies over the same dramatic coastlines that inspired generations of maritime guardians. Standing at the top of one of these towers often produces a quiet moment of appreciation for the people who once lived there full time. Because while the view might be beautiful for a short visit, spending months in that isolated tower through storms, winter winds, and endless quiet evenings required a special kind of patience that modern life rarely demands anymore. And that patience was really the defining quality of lighthouse keepers and lightship crews. They were not explorers searching for fame or captains commanding great fleets. They were careful observers of weather and waves who spent their careers making sure a light remained visible for sailors navigating unfamiliar waters. Night after night, those lanterns blinked steadily across the sea while the keepers followed. The same calm routine of maintenance, observation, and quiet reflection. Their world moved slowly, guided by tides and sunset, rather than crowded schedules or constant communication. The ocean itself became their companion, sometimes peaceful and sometimes dramatic, but always present beyond the tower walls or ship railings. And although technology eventually replaced the need for human guardians, the legacy of those lonely professions still lingers in maritime history. Every lighthouse standing on a rocky cliff and every preserved lightship resting in a harbor carries the quiet memory of people who once lived there, tending lights that guided countless strangers safely through the night. So when we picture the lonely jobs of maritime history, it helps to imagine a small lantern glowing above dark water, while somewhere inside the tower or ship, a keeper quietly checks the flame and looks out across the endless horizon. It is not a loud story or a dramatic one, but it is a calm and steady reminder that sometimes the most important work in history was done by people who spent their lives simply keeping the lights on while the rest of the world sailed past in the distance. And once engineers realized that some dangerous parts of the ocean simply did not have convenient rocks where a lighthouse could be built, maritime authorities came up with a wonderfully practical solution that also happened to be slightly absurd, which was the idea of anchoring an entire ship in one place and turning it into a floating lighthouse that never actually sailed anywhere. These vessels were called lightships, and their job was beautifully simple in theory, because they just needed to sit in hazardous areas of water and display a bright lantern so passing ships could avoid reefs, shoals, or sandbanks that might otherwise ruin a sailor's evening quite dramatically. In practice, however, the experience of living aboard a lightship was about as isolated as maritime life could possibly become, because unlike lighthouse keepers who at least had a tower connected to land somewhere nearby, lightship crews were anchored far out at sea with nothing around them except waves, fog, and the slow-passing silhouettes of ships that rarely stopped to say hello. One of the earliest well-known examples was the Nor lightship, which guarded the entrance to the Thames estuary, where sandbanks created navigation hazards for ships approaching London. And the crew stationed there spent weeks floating in roughly the same location, watching traffic glide past like distant ghosts. A lightship looked somewhat like an ordinary vessel from a distance, except it carried a large lantern mounted high at a mast and often displayed giant painted letters spelling out the name of its station so sailors could identify where they were on the map. These ships were anchored with enormous chains connected to heavy seabed anchors that kept them fixed in position through tides, currents, and storms, which sounds reassuring until you remember that storms are exactly when the ocean tends to behave like a giant washing machine. So while lighthouse keepers experienced wind and crashing waves against solid rock, lightship crews experienced the full rolling motion of the sea 24 hours a day, a sensation that probably felt relaxing at first and deeply exhausting after several weeks of constant movement. Daily life aboard a lightship revolved around maintaining the lantern and fog signals that warned ships during poor visibility, because fog at sea has a talent for appearing suddenly and turning the world into a gray wall where even nearby vessels become invisible. When that happened, the crew activated fog bells or horns, designed to echo across the water at regular intervals, producing a deep rhythmic sound that sailors learned to recognize as a warning that shallow water was somewhere nearby. And if you have ever heard recordings of foghorns drifting through mist, you already know they create an oddly peaceful atmosphere that sounds both lonely and reassuring at the same time. The crew aboard a typical lightship might include 6 to 10 sailors rotating through long shifts, because the lantern needed attention throughout the night and someone always had to monitor weather conditions and passing vessels. During calm weather, the routine was almost hypnotically repetitive, involving cleaning equipment, checking the anchor chain, maintaining the lantern mechanism, and recording weather observations that were later delivered to maritime authorities. When ships passed nearby, the crew sometimes waved or signaled politely, although conversation was impossible unless a vessel stopped close enough for shouted greetings across the water. And most ships did not stop because their entire purpose was to avoid hazards quickly and continue toward their destination, which meant the lightship crew watched hundreds of vessels glide past without ever interacting with the people on board. In that sense, the job felt a bit like living beside a highway where every car passes without stopping, except the highway happens to be an ocean and the nearest town might be 50 miles away. Isolation shaped the personalities of many sailors who accepted lightship assignments because it required a certain comfort with long quiet days and limited human contact. Some crew members brought books, musical instruments, or small craft projects to pass the time, while others simply developed a calm routine of conversation with their shipmates while staring across the water for hours at a time. Meals were simple but dependable because supply vessels visited every few weeks, bringing fresh food, fuel, mail, and replacement equipment that kept the floating station operational. Those visits became highlights of the month, brief moments when the crew could exchange news from the outside world and remind themselves that civilization still existed beyond the horizon. When the supply boat disappeared again, the ocean returned to its familiar silence, broken only by wind, gulls, and the steady creak of anchor chains holding the ship in place. Storms, however, turned that quiet routine into something much more dramatic, because a lightship anchored in open water experienced waves directly instead of hiding behind rocky coastlines like most lighthouses. During severe weather, the vessel rolled heavily from side to side while enormous waves crashed against the hull, and the crew often secured themselves with ropes while moving around the deck to avoid being thrown across the ship like loose furniture. Yet the lantern still had to shine through the darkness because storms were exactly when sailors needed navigational warnings the most. So while lightning flashed across the sky and waves hammered the hull, the lightship crew quietly continued their routine of checking lamps, sounding fog signals, and making sure the vessel remained anchored precisely where it needed to be. The responsibility carried a quiet seriousness because if the anchor chain failed or the lantern went dark, ships passing through dangerous waters might suddenly find themselves navigating blind. And although accidents were rare, the possibility remained in the back of every sailor's mind, reminding them that their unusual floating home served an important purpose even when the days felt uneventful. One particularly famous example operated near the American coast at the Ambrose Channel lightship. which marked the busy approach to New York Harbor, where countless vessels arrived from across the Atlantic. The crew there spent years watching steamships glide toward the harbor skyline, while remaining anchored in the same location, like a stationary witness to maritime traffic. Imagine seeing thousands of travelers arriving in America while you quietly remained in the same floating building, week after week, guiding ships but never joining their journeys. Despite the isolation, many sailors grew fond of lightship duty because it offered steady employment and a slower pace than ordinary seafaring life where crews constantly traveled between ports. Instead of endless voyages, the lightship crew lived in a strange middle ground between land and sea, anchored permanently in one location while the rest of the maritime world flowed past them like a moving river. Eventually, technology began to change the profession, just as it had transformed many other maritime jobs. Electric lamps replaced oil lanterns. Automated systems reduced the need for constant human supervision. And eventually, many lightships were replaced entirely by unmanned light buoys that could flash warnings without requiring anyone to live aboard them. By the late 20th century, most traditional lightships had quietly retired from service, ending a profession that once kept hundreds of sailors stationed in lonely corners of the ocean. A few historic vessels remain preserved today as museum ships, gently reminding visitors of a time when maritime safety depended on crews willing to spend months floating in isolation while watching the endless horizon. And when we think about the loneliest jobs in maritime history, lighthouse keepers and lightship sailors probably deserve a quiet place near the top of the list. They lived slow, patient lives defined by repetition and responsibility, guardians of lights that protected strangers they would never meet. Night after night, those lanterns swept across dark water, guiding ships through fog and storms while the people tending them continued their calm routines inside towers of stone or ships anchored in restless seas. It was not glamorous work, and it rarely appeared in dramatic history books, but it kept countless sailors safe and turned lonely outposts into silent protectors of the maritime world. And in that gentle, steady way, these keepers of light became part of the quiet background of ocean history. Figures who spent their lives watching the horizon while the rest of humanity sailed past toward distant destinations.